أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي قال في كتابه الكريم إني جاعل في الأرض خليفة وقال وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين الإنسان الكامل والكون الجامع الشامل سيدنا ومولانا محمد الذي كان نبيا وآدم بين الماء والطين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما ليث الله الغالب الإمام علي بن أبي طالب الذي كان وليا وآدم بين الماء والطين وعلى القائم المهدي من ذريته الطلعة الرشيدة والغرة الحميدة صاحب الوجه الأغر والنور الأزهر الإمام الثاني عشر الذي كان خاتما للولاية وآدم بين الماء والطين عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله تعالى مخرجه ومكنه في أرضه إماما وخليفة وحجة على العالمين إلى قيام يوم الدين. To proceed. The shadow of Al-Shaykh Al-Akbar wal-Kibrit Al-Ahmar, the greatest Shaykh, the red sulfur, looms large across the Islamic intellectual tradition. And in this conference, we have heard from many scholars about many individuals and many texts that represent the reception of Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi in the Shi'i tradition. Among these is Sayyid Ruhullah al-Khumayni, also known as Ayatollah Khomeini, or simply known as the Ayatollah back in the day. When you just said the Ayatollah, that's who was meant. Sayyid Khomeini was a lifelong student of the writings of the Shaykh al-Akbar, as well as of the Akbari school. And he produced numerous insightful glosses on such works as Dawood al-Qaysari's Sharh on the Fusus al-Hikam, as well as glosses on the Misbah al-Uns, or what's known as the Lamp of Intimacy, which is a Hashia by Mullah Fanari on the commentary Miftah al-Ghaib by, of course, Sadruddin Qunawi, who was a disciple of Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. Now, I just want to try and do something very simple. The time is very, very limited. If I really wanted to do justice to this, I could probably turn this into a book, and we could probably need a 90-minute lecture, but we can't do this. So I have a very simple claim, a very simple contention, and that is that a key doctrine of Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, namely the doctrine of the perfect man, or al-insan al-kamil, set out primarily in the context of this discussion in the Fusus, especially the Fusus, was appropriated by Khomeini in constructing a very recondite and thoroughly metaphysical imamology, which I see as a kind of even political theology, because it very much influenced his political thought. I think this is very important to acknowledge and understand, and I believe that Khomeini has received a lot of attention, but he's received attention as a political leader, and in terms of as a proper thinker within the Akbari tradition, I think he's been very much neglected for whatever reason. So it's very interesting if you look at his political career, and it was, I think, in 89, it was January 1st, 1989, when he dispatched Jawadi Amuli, his student, to what at the time was still the Soviet Union, to deliver a letter to the president of the Soviet Union at that time, which was Mikhail Gorbachev. And it's very interesting. So he's calling, basically, the Soviets to accept Islam. And he was highly criticized for this later, because and the epistle, or the document which was taken and delivered, has been published. It's easily accessible. I've translated it all in the written version of the paper. We don't have time to read it. But he was heavily criticized by the opponents of Irfan in that he's not calling Comrade Gorbachev to the way of the Ahlul Bayt. He's not mentioning the Prophet Muhammad. Who does he in fact mention? So we're not going to read the whole thing, but He first begins by talking about Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Now, it's very important to read these people. He mentions the Ishraqi philosophy of Suhrawardi. He mentions Al-Hikmat al-Muta'ali, or the transcendent wisdom school of Mullah Sadra. And then finally he says, I won't tire you further by mentioning the works of mystics. This is the official translation on his website. In particular, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. If you wish to make yourself acquainted with the doctrines of the celebrated mystics, send a number of your brilliant scholars who are well versed in this field to Qum, so that by reliance on God they may, after a couple of years, glimpse the depth of the delicate stages of gnosis, which will be impossible for them to acquire without making such a journey. Now, the fascinating thing is that there was a response as well. So, sometime in February, I've been able to determine, 1989, the Soviet foreign minister at that time, Eduard Shevardnadze, who was Georgian, embarked upon a 10-day visit to the region, West Asia or the Middle East, and Iran, where he was to present the reply that Khomeini gave in person. And the amazing thing is someone made a video, and it's on YouTube. I'm not going to play it here, but basically, Shevardnadze has an interpreter, and he tells Khomeini that Gorbachev, along with the prominent leadership of the Soviet Union, had read his letter, and while there were many points raised in the letter which they were in agreement, however, they were matters therein regarding which they differed with them, very diplomatic, like, we're not interested in this stuff. And at that point, Khomeini just says, and I'm translating here, he says, but tell him, i.e. Gorbachev, that I had wished to offer you an opening to broader horizons. ولی به ایشان what is it؟ ولی به ایشان بگید که من میخواستم که کنار شما یک فضای بزرگتر باز کنم. So then he just stands up and leaves. And they ask the end of it, and the video is quite extraordinary, and Shevardnadze is sort of thinking, what did I do? What did I do? So I think this is a very interesting episode, in as much as it shows Khomeini's complete and total devotion to Ibn Arabi. And this is 1989. This is after the infamous, Valentine's Day fatwa against an author, someone who wrote a book called The Satanic Verses. Yeah, him. So it's very strange. So, and he, he's completely devoted to Ibn Arabi. So I think really, if you want to understand what this man was about, it's very important to sort of look into what Ibn Arabi is about. So what I'm going to try and talk about is, I'm a text person, so I want to look at the basic sort of what we would call the locus classicus of the Insan al-Kamil, or the perfect man doctrine. And that, of course, is the opening or the opening paragraph. It's really the whole chapter, but in particular, the very difficult opening paragraph of the Fusus al-Hikam, or the quintessence of wisdom, or the bezels of wisdom of Ibn Arabi. Now, this has been commented on at length in various commentaries, and it appears in other works as well. And if you look at the glosses of Khomeini on the commentary on the Fusus by Al-Qaysari. So this is very important. You have to understand there's a sort of a silsila, a connected master-disciple chain of commentaries that appears on the Fusus. So in case you don't know, the first real commentary is, the real genuine commentary is by his immediate disciple Sadruddin Qunawi. There was another one by Afif ad-Din al-Tilmisani, who's also a disciple of his. To my knowledge, it remains in manuscript. I've seen some good manuscripts. But really, Sadruddin Qunawi's commentary is considered sort of the commentary, the first one. But it's thematic. It's not line by line, word by word. Then the real one, the real word by word commentary, line by line commentary, is by his disciple Al-Jandi. Then that's followed by his own disciple Al-Kashani, followed by his own disciple Al-Qaysari. But if you really look at all of these, the real meat is really in Al-Jandi. I wish people would study that one more, but for whatever reasons, Al-Qaysari's text becomes a kind of school text. And he writes a bunch of muqaddimat. There's 12 of them. And the last one is about this whole business of walaya and prophecy and so forth. So I'm not going to read the whole gloss for you. I'm just going to mention it at the end. In many places, actually, in Khomeini's glosses on Qaysari, to put it mildly, he disagrees with a lot of things Qaysari has said. And he disagrees with what he has said here, and at the end of that, he notes that I have written, a rather nice treatise on this, but he doesn't mention the name of it. Well, that treatise is this book, Misbah al-Hidayah ila al-Khilafati wal-Wilaya. I first came across this book in the Princeton University Library when I was a graduate student. I must have been 25. And I took it back to my dorm room and I read it in one night. But it was a very bad edition, and I'm very glad this good edition has come out. And that's really where Khomeini sets out his understanding of the doctrine of the perfect man and how that is connected with the whole question of imamah, the whole problem of khilafah. And it's very interesting because for him it is a metaphysical question in this treatise. It is a metaphysical and even a sort of cosmological problem. It is not a debate about what happened at the Saqifa of Bani Sa'ida. In other words, it's not a historical, polemical sort of discussion. So it's not a historical problem. It's not even here a theological problem, because imamah is, in Kalam text, a theological question. This is a question of metaphysics, and it's intimately tied in with Wahdatul Wujud. So when Khomeini writes this, he sets out his ideas in this treatise, Misbah al-Hidayah, or the lamp of guidance toward caliphate and walaya, nearmostness, if you like, proximity. Don't like the word sainthood or sanctity for many reasons. And in this book, he is not only influenced, of course, by Ibn Arabi, but also by the elaboration of the doctrines of Ibn Arabi by Sadruddin Qunawi. Now, I'd just like to say a word or two about Sadruddin Qunawi. He's extremely original. He doesn't really repeat things that Ibn Arabi says verbatim, like a devoted sort of disciple. He is very original in his expression, in his use of language, the way he writes. So he compiles this book called Miftah al-Ghaib, or Keys to the Unseen. And it is a further meditation on ideas which are there in the Fusus al-Hikam, because the Fusus al-Hikam, I read and consider, and many other people do as well, consider it to be a kind of elaboration truly of the doctrine of al-Insan al-Kamil. And so he develops the same thing in this book, Miftah al-Ghaib, and this later goes on to become a very important school text in the Ottoman curriculum and has a huge hashiyah or super commentary on it by Mullah Fanari. So just to give you an idea, the Miftah al-Ghaib is a relatively short book. It's probably about the same length as the Fusus, give or take. It's about like this. And it's published with the commentary, with the edition of Khajavi, and it's about 700 pages thick. So you can imagine, and small type, and a lot of other notes and so on and so forth that are there. So Khomeini also wrote glosses on this, but I'm not going to have time to talk about there what Sadruddin Qunawi says there. So let's look then at the locus classicus, which is the opening part of the Fusus by Ibn Arabi. And this is a famous or even a kind of infamous passage because it's really, really difficult. There's a lot of parenthetical remarks there. And I'm just going to read this. It's not very long. I'm not going to burden you with it very long. I'm just going to read this very quickly. This is my own translation. When the Absolute, may he be glorified, in respect of his most beautiful names, which are beyond number, wished to see their essences, or you could say, when he wished to see himself in an all-inclusive object, encompassing the divine command in its totality, which, qualified by existence, would reveal to him his own mystery, for the seeing of a thing itself by itself is not the same as its seeing itself in another, as it were in a mirror. Now the imagery of the mirror is very important. So what is implicit here, and again, many people have said this already in this today, you have to understand the Quran if you're going to understand Ibn Arabi. This is a reference to the opening, the first 30 ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah, around where it says, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. And when your Lord said to the angels, I am placing upon the earth a Khalifa, and it goes on, and the key point is that Allah teaches him all the names. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. And he taught Adam him the names, all of them. So this is the context of this. And this notion of the mirror is a kind of reflection, where it's this being. Adam represents kind of primordial humanity, or the essence of human beings, and the divine names are reflected therein. And so this image of the mirror is very important. So it says that the seeing of a thing itself by itself is not the same as its seeing itself in another, as it were in a mirror, for it appears to itself in a form that is invested by the locus of the vision, a vision which could not appear without the existence of such a locus and its self-disclosure therein. The Absolute bestowed existence upon the cosmos in its entirety, which was shadow, amorphous without spirit. The term in Arabic is ruh. And thus was it akin to an unpolished mirror. You have to understand, in pre-modern times there were metal mirrors, and they could get rusted and you have to polish them. And then it goes on. For the divine providence never establishes a locus, a mahal, without it receiving a divine spirit, which he expressed as, in the Quran, in Surah 21, verse 91, the breathing into him. In other words, the breathing of the divine breath that animates the primordial clay of Adam. And this is but the realization of the amorphous form's innate disposition to receive the inexhaustible overflowing of self-revelation, which has always been and will ever be, and outside of which remains only the receptacle, which itself only exists from the most holy superabundance, what is called al-fayd al-aqdas. For the whole affair, al-amr is the term in Arabic, in its entirety, is from him, capital H, Allah, in its beginning and in its end. And to him returns the whole affair, just as it began with him. So this is a highly recondite expression by Ibn Arabi of the process of manifestation. And so later commentators in the commentary tradition, they introduce a whole terminology which is actually derived from the treatment of abstract quiddity by Nasiruddin al-Tusi in actually the Tajrid al-I'tiqad, another book which I've worked on. And so you have this notion that God is utterly and completely unknown and hidden. And a hadith is quoted. Now, I know that this is not a hadith which can be backed up by isnad and asanid and so forth, but we are way beyond all of that. This is the realm of kashf. And this text runs like this. There's some slight variation. It says, and God is speaking in the first person. It's a holy hadith or holy tradition when which Allah speaks in the first person. كنت كنزا مخفيا فأحببت أن أعرف فخلقت الخلق لكي أعرف. I was a hidden treasure. I loved to be known. This is key. I loved to be known. So I created the creation that they may know me. Now it also says, of course, in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِي. There's a kasra. And I created jinns and men, or mankind or humankind, only that they may worship me. Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, the sixth Imam, was asked, what does this mean? And he says that they may know me. So this is an idea that is there. And so you have the terminology which is introduced is that you have God is seen philosophically or ontologically as pure being. Al-wujud al-baht is the term that Al-Kashani uses in his own introduction to his commentary on the Fusus. Some people also use al-wujud al-mahd, pure being, sheer being. Al-wujud min haythu huwa al-wujud, being qua being. And in these stages of manifestation, there is a point, and again, this is a symbolic language. Khomeini, in the Misbah al-Hidayah, says that language here breaks down. So you have Allah, or pure being, utterly non-delimited, non-determined, la bishart, completely undetermined, beyond even the condition of being non-conditioned. Then you have God, who is Allah, or being, negatively conditioned, wujud bi sharti la, and then wujud bi sharti shay, and then conditioned being. So these are the kind of terminology that was used, and this text, this kuntu kanzan makhfiyan text, is also invoked there. And Sadruddin Qunawi, actually, in the Miftah al-Ghaib, he spends a lot of time working all of this out and explaining all this. He's not long-winded, it's just very long. That's why we don't have time to go into it. But that's where there is a really serious development of this way before Khomeini. And again, Khomeini read and glossated, is that right? Is that correct? Composed glosses upon this very key text. And historically speaking, there's another very important text which I just want to mention, then I will get to Khomeini and try and wrap it up. And that is this very important text by Sayiad Ibn Turka al-Isfahani. This is one of many printed editions. This is a nice handy one with the glosses of Hassan Zada Amuli rahimahullah. And this is actually a commentary by Sayiad Ibn Turka al-Isfahani on a text by his grandfather, which is about, it was called Risalat, the original title is Risalat Qawaid al-Tawheed, and this is his Tamheed, At-Tamheed fi Sharhi Risalati Qawaid al-Tawheed. I think that's the title. So it's a book about Tawheed. And again, I like very much what Professor Lawson said about it, how did you exactly put it? It's interconnecting. And so his grandfather wrote this treatise to try and defend the doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud in a philosophical way. So on the one hand, you have Kashf. Wahdatul Wujud, apparently this is what you get through the Kashf, right? And then he's trying to defend this to the Masha'i philosophers. He has a Masha'i or peripatetic or Avicennian audience, and he's trying to do that. And so his grandson then comments upon this. And so the whole beginning of the text is devoted to that. And then, more or less more than halfway through, about 2/3 of the way through, they shift, so to speak, and start talking about al-insan al-kamil. And this paragraph, a portion of this paragraph which I read to you, is quoted. But his grandfather never says where it's from. He just says, qila, it is said. And of course, his grandson then says, well, this is directly from Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam. And, there's someone who's been working on Sayiad Ibn Turka al-Isfahani, someone named Matthew Melvin Kushki, and he wrote a very nice dissertation on him, and he portrays him as a complete letrist, and he has invented something completely pulled out of thin air called Tashkik al-Harf, which has no basis. But my point is here that he neglects, he downplays the importance of this book in Ibn Turka al-Isfahani. And because Kushki is interested in lettrism and numbers and numerology and abjad and Ra'um al-Ghariba and all of this, he thinks this is not an important book. So I just want to say, by way of footnote here, that when Ibn Turka al-Isfahani takes his grandfather's text, he divides it up into paragraphs because he has to comment on it. And he divides them up exactly into 66. 66 is the abjad of Allah. Surely Kushki knows this, but for whatever reason he apparently hasn't noticed this. When he begins his discussion on al-insan al-kamil, that is paragraph 45. 45 is the abjad of Adam. 45, 4 plus 5, if you take the mufrad, adds up to 9. Also, the numbers from 1 to 9 add up to 45. So the 1 through 9 is all the maratib al-wujud. Those numbers from 1 through 9 can be arranged in the 3x3 wifq, or the 3x3 which we heard about, someone was talking about. And anyway, so this is also encoded there. I wonder if there's similar things in Khomeini. I have some speculation on that. I will maybe mention that in the written version of the paper, but I wanted to point that out. So there is this kind of historical continuity in terms of the datings of these texts. And Khomeini does not have glosses on the Tamheed, but it's definitely part of the curriculum. There's no doubt he would have read it. As you said, it's part of the, what do you call it, the Qajar, the Irfan trilogy. I like that turn of phrase. So he definitely would have read it. And all of this is reflected in the Misbah al-Hidayah. So I just want to turn to a few, I'm not going to read it to you, I have summarized it all. So there's an idea, especially among these Akbari thinkers, that the entirety of the content of the Fusus al-Hikam is encoded in the opening khutbah. And if you read Qunawi's commentary, he says that one day he was reading this back to Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, his teacher, and he went into the state, and the whole meaning of the book was revealed to him after, it's like 17 words or something were read. Jandi claims the same experience. And there was also, in medieval Islamic rhetoric and writing, there was a method whereby they would have a kind of opening, but the turns of phrase would allude to the titles of books which they had used. It's a kind of strange way of doing a bibliography, and it's a very difficult literary feat to pull off. And I'm convinced there's a similar thing going on in the opening of Khomeini's treatise. Now, again, by way of just completeness, Arabic was not his language. And so, as is the case with many non-Arabs, Iranians, Indians, Turks, when they would write this way, they would kind of go a bit over the top. And so it's a little bit too much. Now, the person who really pulled it off was Ibn Turk al-Isfahani. He really can pull it off. It works as literature. In the case of Khomeini, in some places it's a little bit too much, and some of the words are a little bit unnecessary. They're just there for literary flourish. Nevertheless, in the opening, for example, he says, "Praise is due to Allah, enduring and unmoved." The word he uses there is al-mustakin. And that is sort of like this unmoved mover concept, which you have in Aristotle. Veiled in darkness, concealed by the divine attributes and names, utterly hidden in the might of his glory, yet manifest and unveiled by the light of his majesty. He who by the sheer force of his greatness is veiled from the hearts of those who are nearest to him, yet who is manifest in the mirrors of his vicegerents. That's the word he uses, khulafa here, due to the intensity of his brilliance. So what Khomeini is doing here is he is introducing this notion of al-insan al-kamil and the notion of khilafa into the whole scheme of manifestation, of divine sort of emanation. And again, he says language does break down. It is an image. A lot of people also forget. I mean, this idea goes all the way back to Plotinus, that Plotinus, when he's also talking about this, he says this is a language, right? I mean, are there really three hypostases, all this, or is this just a language? And it's kind of a pointer. The ultimate thing is you have to get that kind of Fani experience, right? So what Khomeini actually does then is that the text is divided into two mishkats, two niches. Yeah, thank you. And the first mishkat has 6 lamps or misbahs, 56 in all. Then there's the second mishkat, and that's divided into 3 misbahs, and they're subsections. But it's not an extremely long book. But it is a very dense and difficult book. So I'm just going to go through the first few lamps very quickly. So in the first misbah, yes, I will do it quickly. The first misbah, he talks about how in this state of being utterly non-conditioned, he uses terms such as al-huwiyatul ghaybiyatul ahadiyya in Arabic. He uses al-anqa al-mughrib, and that's very important because that was a treatise by Ibn Arabi. He uses the term al-mustakin fi ghayb al-huwiyya. He uses terms such as al-haqiqatul kamina tahta as-saradiqat al-nuriyya wal-hujab al-dhulmaniyya. This is very dense sort of Arabic. So the singular, unique, hidden, divine ipseity, the magnificent greifen, the enduring and unmoved in the hiddenness of the divine ipseity, and so forth. And so he says that God, if we want to use theological language rather than ontological language, in his divine essence, is utterly independent and utterly concealed and utterly unmoved. When he uses the sense of unmoved, it means that he is utterly singular, he is simple. This is very interesting because this is basitul haqiqa stuff, about meaning that he is not a composite of potency and act. And then in the second, he says that this is my paraphrase or summation, this utterly non-delimited and non-determined sheer reality gazes, as it were, at nothing. It is utterly independent, unmoved, unchanged in and of itself alone. It is not reflected in any kind of form nor mirrored in any entity. Then he speaks about how language itself breaks down in struggling to speak of this utterly non-delimited reality. Moreover, this inwardly hidden, or this inward hiddenness and opacity of concealment should not be construed or understood as logical opposites of dhuhur or manifestation. He's building up to something. Then he goes on and he explains that it is not connected, this divine essence is not connected to the creation. And any indications in the writings or the terminology of the awliya that seem to point in this direction must be interpreted and understood in accordance with what he has already said. And moreover, he denounces the people he calls ashab, at-takallum, or the mutakallimun, the run-of-the-mill kalam theologians, as well as the run-of-the-mill philosophers, what he calls arbabul falsafa al-rasmiya. And he says that it's extremely important to have the balance between tanzih and tashbih, between transcendence or immanence, or incomparability and similarity is the Shi'i way of rendering that, William C. Shi'i. This is an allusion, an ishara to chapter 3 of the Fusus, devoted to the chapter on Noah, where this is discussed. And the ayah laysa kamithlihi shay is discussed there, and he's just pointing there. Then he mentions some hadiths from the imams that support tanzih and tashbih. And finally, he says that the divine names and attributes also are not connected to this hidden realm. And for them to become manifest, there is a need for a divinely appointed Khalifa in all orders of wujud, all orders of being, because this is still all wujud. So for him, that is what the Khalifa or the reality of the Khalifa is. That is what the Prophet Muhammad and Ali are supposed to be. That's why it has to be reflected in the world. So there are a lot of ideas that are converging here. There's the concept of al-insan al-kamil Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. He's taking that, interpreting it as Khalifa and as Imam. It's tying it with the concept of walaya. And there's also, if you haven't realized yet, the notion of the philosopher king. This is very much there in Al-Farabi. This is very much there even at the end of the Ilahiyat by the Shifa ibn Sina, and we can talk about this. But my contention is that this all influences his idea of wilayat al-faqih. It has to have influenced him, as much as I would construe this as sort of his esoteric doctrine, the inner side of his political theology. And I just mean it in the literal meaning of the term. I'm not evoking Carl Schmitt or anybody here. So this is his political theology. And yes, there's an extended argument in that text on in Persian, Vilayat al-Faqih. And yes, I know that there are problems there, and you can argue, so this is the business of the fuqaha. But I am convinced that he saw some sort of relation there. And, it's not polite in Muslim society, particularly if you are involved in irfan or in tasawwuf, to sort of refer to yourself as a great authority. But I think that he did have, in terms of his own articulation within himself, of his self-image, that he saw himself as someone who had completed the fourth journey, the 4 journeys of Mullah Sadra, and saw himself as somehow having this mantle of the Prophet, and this is what he had to do. And I think that this is why he pursued certain policies, which would have been by any sort of Machiavellian approach or a realpolitik approach, is completely against. I mean, why do you have to give this fatwa? Why do you have to, do all these sorts of things? So I think that I'm wrapping up now. If we really want to appreciate, because for better or worse, he had an extremely important influence on modern history, regardless of what we think of him. And if we really want to understand what is behind that, we need to know this background. My professor Michael Cook once said in some interview or something he gave about how, if you want to understand some sort of modern Western history in the modern world, you really don't have to have read Aquinas and Duns Scotus and Juarez and these people. Suarez, not Juarez. Francisco Suarez and these people. But if you want to understand even modern politics in the Muslim world, you have to know something about Ibn Taymiyyah. And of course that's in the Salafi world of things, but I would argue that if you really want to understand Tashayyu' and Shia intellectuality and how it's influenced politics in the modern world up to this very moment, you have to know about Ibn Arabi. I mean, the book that you talked about by Yahya Bono, it was in French. Unfortunately, I have not been able to get this. And there's an Arabic translation. Who did the Arabic translation? He's something al-Musawi. He's a Sayiad. He's a Musawi Sayyid, and he happens to be a member of the Hezbollah. I watched an interview with him on al-Mayadeen. And he said that this was a very important book. So this is, again, this sort of political theology. The Muslim never really sort of had this notion of a distinction between politics and religion, and that's very true here as well. And I think that in the case of Walayat al-Faqih, it is ultimately rooted in this kind of as I called it, a metaphysical imamology, and I will just leave it at that. Thank you very much for your patience. That was 35 minutes on my stopwatch, so.
Yeah. You had 25 allotted, but anyhow, it's fine.
I thought I had 30. I stand corrected.
And in a second, Sayyidina Ali's. Okay, so we'll open up some brief questions because we want to get to the closing remarks, but I'm sure there are some questions. Yes, Dr. Khalid?
The mic.
I was hoping you might comment about the relationship between the primordial Adam. You share that beautiful passage from the Fusus where God created this image or this mirror for himself. What would you say is the relationship between the primordial Adam and the Haqiqa Muhammadiyah? And which of them has priority in terms of the temporal sequence of creation?
Yes, very good. That's a very interesting question. So in chapter 1 of the Fusus is a kind of so the last chapter connects to the first. It's not a line, it's a circle. Do you understand? And Adam represents the symbol for all of humanity, right? But at the same, and all of humanity includes the perfect man. But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is chapter 27. So if you don't know, all of the chapters of the Fusus, or the bezels of wisdom, the quintessence of wisdom, are devoted to a particular Quranic prophet, and there's a symbol, it's understood symbolically. Thank you so much. Thank you. And each of these prophets, these Quranic prophets, especially the heart of that Quranic prophet, the kharabat, Dr. Tasbihi, of that prophet, the Kaaba of the heart, is seen as a locus of manifestation or a place of tajalli of certain divine names. So ordinary human beings, they have various sort of divine names potentially available to them, and it is what they have to complete in their 4 journeys in this life. But when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he has the totality of all of the names. But in terms of the priority of temporal succession, so Adam is created first as a flesh and blood individual. Otherwise, the light of the Prophet Muhammad, so this is the actual Khalifa, the Wali, so forth. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is Rasul Khuda, he is Rasulullah ﷺ in every order of being. And there is a hadith, and Ibn Arabi quotes a lot of hadiths, and I quoted that, and I followed the same tradition. I encapsulated my entire lecture in my Arabic opening khutbah, which is, the hadith is, Kuntu Nabiyan wa Adamu bayna al-ma'i wa tin. I was a prophet when Adam was between water and clay. And there are other slightly different wordings, and this is not a hadith seminar. But I have the full takhrij in my critical edition of all of these things. So there is this idea. There's also the idea of what is called an-nur al-Muhammadi or al-haqiqat al-Muhammadiyya. This is before time. This is not a temporal succession. Time has no meaning here. And there are also hadiths in the Sunni tradition about this. There's a famous hadith which is, the rawi is Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. And the Prophet ﷺ says to him, أَوَّلُ شَيْءٍ خُلِقَ نُورُ نَبِيِّكَ يَا Jabir. The first thing to be created was the light of your Prophet, O Jabir. Now the hadith sticklers like to say, well, this is supposed to be in the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq al-San'ani, and if you actually go and look there, you don't find it. And I say to them, well, you should read the introduction by the editor, Habib al-Rahman al-A'zami. This survives in only one manuscript. It is in the Mullah Murad collection, and it is incomplete. It is not nuskha naqisa. And the fact is that all of these medieval authorities, they quote this hadith. And there are other things in the Shia tradition, that abundant hadiths in the Shia traditions that talk about the light of Muhammad, the light of the Imam. So he is actually prior, but in historical time, opaque time, الزمان الكثيف, he comes at the end. Otherwise, he's before. So I hope that answers your question.
Any other questions? And then we're going to go to the... Okay, one more and then we'll go to the closing remarks.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sayyid, I appreciate the fact that your thesis that the doctrine of Wilayat al-Faqih is a lead-up or inspired by his Imam Khomeini's, influenced by his training in Irfan. But if we're more precise with our language, I mean, you know, the Wilayat al-Faqih is like wilaya of the Zahiri, of fiqh. It seems very strange to me that Irfan, which is fundamentally dealing with the batin, and now his whole politics is embodied by this idea of wilaya of the faqih. Should be maybe wilayat al-hakim, wilayat al-arif, because fiqh wasn't the criteria of the nas of Imam Ali, or his authority after the Prophet is not based on his fiqh, is based on the hukm batini, the nas, something else, a spiritual principle. So I'm curious, maybe you can shed some insight into this. Why would he choose a term which is very external, very exoteric, in considering the fact he's an arif, considering the fact of his training of
because the
Insan
vast
al-Kamil?
majority of people in the world are not urafah, and that includes the vast majority of fuqaha, and he's addressing, qishriyun. That's people of the husk, or people who are zahir bin, kor, chashmi people. That is how the majority of the fuqaha have been throughout history. And he's working in terms of a fiqh sort of framework. And when you're doing that, but also in the philosophical tradition, there is this idea that, in Avicenna, for example, I understand sort of the end of the ilahiyat is sort of like an appendix, like an ethical, hikmah, amaliya sort of conclusion to the. But that's the idea there, that if a person truly realizes all of these things, and that's how Ibn Sina uses very strong language. He says something like, what does he actually say? I think he says, يَكَادُ أَن يَصِيرَ رَبًّا إِنسَانِيًا, if I'm not mistaken. It's easy to look up if we had it, because on the last page, last paragraph, last sentence, that that the philosopher king becomes almost a human lord. Right. Yeah, and so there is an idea that if you actually, so there is this notion that there is a kind of certain degree of perfectibility of ordinary human beings as well, aside from the ma'sumin. But you never become Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You never become Ali. You can asymptotically approach them, to use a term from mathematics. And I think that Khomeini probably saw himself as that way. He wasn't going to stand up and say, "Hey, I'm the guy," but he in effect did. Right? He didn't explicitly say that, but he sort of designed this office that sort of fits only on him. Yeah. So, that would be my take on it. But the only thing I was trying to say is that there is a deep sort of Sufi metaphysical sort of background to this. And I would like to add to that if you want the point that you're making, well, the tasawwuf or irfan is a part of the batin and so forth, you know that the batin is not disconnected from the zahir, and the zahir is not connected from the batin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is هو الظاهر في بطونه والباطن في ظهوره. أبطن فأظهر وأظهر فأبطن. It's both and. Tanzih and tashbih both. And so that has to have its corollary in the realm of practical wisdom, al-hikmatul amaliyya, and that's, of course, a-siyasatul madaniyya. Political economy. Thank you.